introduce myself. My name is Nigel Atkins. I'm dual national, British and French. I can't hide the fact that I have a British accent when I speak French, but my French wife is with me today. So I consider myself European because I'm also a Czech resident, so I'm not just a Brit who's flown in from London. I'm not going to sort of make it a personal story of my father. I just really want to explain to you a little bit about this particular squadron 138 and to use my father's history to explain why and how they were flying into Denmark on the 10th and 11th of December 1943. This is not just any painting of Halifax. In fact, Mark was saying he saw one of Ron Hockey, as I know very well this story because living in Prague at Hydrick. This is an actual painting of the plane that crashed, BB378, which we bought in an auction last year. We don't know who ordered it, but I was informed by the Thamesford Association there'd be an auction. So this plane was the very plane, for whatever reason, was painted and today represents the plane which crashed, and it's, I'll explain a little bit later. Why Roskilde? Roskilde was the name of our house, and go back many, many years ago when I was 4 or 5, my father bought a plot of land, built a house to the west of London. Those times it was way out in the country. We lived in a road which was about 2 kilometres long, and only the British could actually build a road and not put a number. So you can imagine when I was at school, my father, for whatever reason, he had his own reasons, called it Roskilde. So as a school, when I used to say, friends used to come and stay, I used to say, well, I lived in Roskilde. And it took me 60 years to come back to Roskilde. So somewhere, this was the very last one before my father died in the year 2000. So throughout my life, Roskilde was part of our family. I just want to bring out this figure, which we talked about SOE, but basically over 20,400 British and Commonwealth Air Force members died with no grave. I think we should stop to think about this number of the sacrifice. This is actually a memorial on the island of Runnymede, just outside Windsor. It's very specific because it's on Runnymede where the Magna Carta was signed, and it has a relevance, as you'll see later, to this crew who came into Denmark in December '43. Why did my father decide to go into the Air Force? I don't know. It's like these stories like with Ulla Lund. We never really had a chance to speak really to our parents about it because they didn't really want to talk about it. And I can only imagine my father was 17 when the war broke out, living in London. This was the Blitz. And I think this is the only way that my father I think felt that he could really make an effort to the war. Secondly, his own father, my grandfather, had a distinguished army career. He was in the Battle of the Somme, he was in the Indian Army and was a lieutenant colonel in the Second World War. And I think my father just really wanted to show to his father he was capable of doing it his way. He wouldn't tell me that, but I particularly feel that way. And this is the Blitz of London. This was a study carried out by the BBC, you can get it on internet, and Portsmouth University. It's not really the whole of London, but every one of these red dots is a bomb which fell on London. If you go onto the internet, it will explain to you exactly why, how many people killed, and you can see the density to the east, which was the Docklands. One of these bombs, which is off this map, was in fact 300 metres away from the house which my parents or my father lived with his brother. And I'd just like to say, how did I get this information? I'll show you. Certainly, unfortunately, not from my father. Mark is a very modest person, but when he was the historian of the Imperial War Museum, he did, in fact, record or organise the recording of a lot of members of the different squadrons. And my father's was recorded, and I have 2 hours of fairly detailed career pattern in the Royal Air Force of my father. So that was one of them. Secondly, it was my uncle, who's 90 next week. For health reasons, he cannot be with us, which I feel he gave me a good insight, really, as well, into my father's wartime career. So, my father, we'll go on to this, when he was called up eventually, when he was 19, which was in May 1942, 40 years, 42. They couldn't really have the training in the UK. They did about 4 months, and they were actually sent to America. Actually sent on the Queen Mary boat, not in the deluxe cabins. I was working in the bakery. But in this recording we have, there's quite a remarkable way he explains by his arrival in New York, from the land of bombardment to New York, whereby it's the land of plenty. So he was sent to the south of to Georgia, where he became part of the US, for this purpose, US Air Force. Unfortunately, he went in as a pilot. Unfortunately, he went down with measles, which is not a serious illness, but it meant that he lost 2 weeks of his training, which meant he was behind. He couldn't get back onto the course which he was on, and he couldn't get onto the next one, because it was really high pressure. So he was sent to Canada, and he trained as what they called a second pilot, and what they were aiming for at the time was in fact to increase also navigation and bombing as we started to bomb substantially Germany. So he stayed in Canada for 6 months, came back into the UK, and was transferred into an airfield called Beverley, which was the ones where they recruited the squadrons, and he was selected to join the 138 squadron. This being in June 1943. You can see that when in America it was not just hard training. This was a photo which I have about 100 photos, not like this, but I actually, when I was 20, went back and stayed with one of the families in Georgia. As Mark was saying, it was all around this legendary airfield where they joined, and my father joined in June 1943. Very secret. My uncle said my father never said ever what he was doing. Obviously this was very, very special. And again, I think it was in his way of living that he never really expressed it later on in life either. So this was the crew. Why they were chosen, my father's a bit surprised because he thought others were more qualified. I think it's due to this, as we'll see later, rather exceptional pilot, Peter Barter. My father was here as second pilot, bomb aimer. Briggs was the rear gunner. We had, my father kept a very close contact later with the navigator, who was Canadian. And you'll see that that had a role later when the plane crashed. And Anderson, he was the flight engineer. So this was in September 1943. Before, this is really when they started, we have the list of it. But when they arrived in June, July, on the 28th of July, they were called off the 138, and bomber Harris decided in July to bomb Hamburg. And they were part of the 1,000 planes, partly American, partly French. The Americans the day, the British the night, which on the 28th of July bombed Hamburg, what's known as the Firestorm. Rather tragic for the civilian population of Hamburg. It was done in the sense of extreme heat. They had metal tinsel which they dropped, so the Germans were completely unable to really defend the city. And in the space of 2 days, 12 square kilometers were destroyed. 42,000 people died. And Hitler and Goebbels wouldn't even go to visit it. So it's really one of the first instances whereby my father was asked on his questions, how did he feel about taking part in this bombing? There was a silence. Obviously he felt he was a professional, being said, and this was the first instance where the British could show to their population they were capable of attacking Germany. This is the plane we're talking about, Halifax, which is a legendary plane. Just, I'll show you this part, which is the gun tower. In fact, on the 138 squadron, this was taken away from the plane because they were not really attacking, they were just going out flying into agents and containers. And this is, as I said, by a miracle, the BB378. And you can see the gun turret was taken away, but they had a hatch at the top. You'll see later the relevance of this. There's a lot of destiny in this story. It's my father's medal with the Bomber Command. But I should say that 138 was technically under Bomber Command. These are the flights which they carried out. I won't go into all details, but you can see a lot were into France. I'll come back onto Yugoslavia. This is a particularly important one because they flew into, which was the centre of the Maquis, or the French resistance, into Grenoble. 4 planes went in that night, and they all arrived. I can imagine flying across into Grenoble was not, but there's one particular book, I hope I have it there, and I'll show it later. It doesn't matter, I'll come back onto it. It was a specific flight to get in. As Mark was saying, you saw the photo of the resistance. I'm not saying it's this plane which dropped in these Sten guns, but that was the part of the missions of it. They say that maybe 1 out of 5 pilots or crewmen never came back. This was their flights, particularly to France. One thing which wasn't, this is Yugoslavia. We have to put it back. 43 was a very part of the times when the wars were changing. The Italians went into ceasefire. The British and Americans managed to control Algeria and Tunisia. And my father's crew were taken off 138 for 2 weeks, taken from London through to Gibraltar, and then to Algeria, to Tunisia, and from Tunisia they made specific flights into Yugoslavia. Why in October 1943? Because Churchill had decided in September to back Tito. And because they had bases in Algeria, Tunisia, they were able to get into Yugoslavia. And on the 20th of September, Churchill sent in Fitzroy MacLean, who was a member of Parliament speaking Serbian, to be with Tito, and as well he took with him his son. Randolph Churchill went out on that date. And like has it, we have all the flights detailed, so we know exactly where the landing positions were. So we know they were dropping on this part, what today is on the border of Bosnia and Croatia. There's a lot of destiny in the story because for professional reasons I go out to Bosnia. I was in Bosnia, Croatia 2 weeks ago on business, and I found the actual dropping zone. Now, it doesn't look like Mark Seaman, but here's the Serbian Mark Seaman. He's a bishop in the Orthodox Serbian church. This part of the world was there were 250,000 Serbians before the war, 150,000 before the events in 1990, and there are only now 10,000. So here's the bishop of this area. This is the actual mission, and they said on this is when they arrived. They said they circled over and were able in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 turns to get in the 4 agents and the 9 containers. And the bishop found for me on this site a memorial, what's left of it, of the parachutists. And this was, from our estimation, the very first flight into this area, which was in the 3rd to 10th of October 1943. And so we come on to, rather long, but I come on to it now, was Table Jam 18, which was in fact the flight which they brought in December. Why Table Jam? Table was the name given to the organisation of the sabotage in Denmark, and Jam was given to Flemming Muus. And this is the actual mission for them to fly out. In fact, you can see the date. Originally was the 3rd of December, but due to weather, and I'll just say a few words about weather, they were called the Moonlight Squadrons. Why moonlight? Because they could only fly by moonlight. So full moon, 5 days before, 5 days after. And so if there's bad weather, and they cannot fly out. So I mean, they were limited, and also you'll see that they flew very low. When they're flying over the North Sea, they were flying about 10 metres. Over Denmark, 40, under the radar, they hoped. Moving up to about 80 for the parachuting out of the agent. So this is the actual most secret with a one-man agent. I'll try and say very quickly and briefly a little bit about Flemming Muus, who they brought in on that day. You have to remember, they were not on Danish flights. They were like taxi drivers that considered themselves that were given a mission. And this was a particularly important mission because Flemming Muus was the head of the SOE mission in Denmark, Major. In a few words, he was actually when war broke out in Africa, managed to get himself back to the UK, one of the 10 Danish in training in 1943, and was selected by Hollingworth, the Commander Hollingworth, as being the most appropriate person for sabotage. Because that's basically what they were brought in for, was to blow up railways, sabotage the Germans in Denmark. He wrote a book, which I hope I have here, I see it here, called The Spark and the Flame in the 1950s. You can still get it on Amazon. And in it, he explains how they practiced blowing up the London to Glasgow Express. All right, come again. Just to say how important he was, he went under plastic surgery in March or February 1943 before he flew out, so his mother couldn't even recognise him. And it was done in a way that it would last for a year and his natural features would come back. It was so secret in the hospital, so he says, and we always have to it, that the equivalent of Marlene Dietrich, Vera Lynn, was brought in, and they said that in the hospital he was rehearsing a theatre, and Vera Lynn herself came to visit him just to put some substance to the story. He was parachuted in March 1943 and was a very important role in the major sabotage railways before you had your parliamentary change in the end of August, creation of the Freedom Council, and he was one of the people that was actually, along with Stig Jensen, which we'll note, involved with the Freedom Council. That's Flemming Muus with his wife, well, to-be Irena, Mr. Gesler. If you have seen the famous video, which, excuse my Danish, which is called Winston Gruppen, he is with the SOE contact, which is in that video. We'll have later a few words said about the mother of Flemming Muus' wife, Monica Richfield, who was Anglo-Irish, and the only woman under the Germans, I'm talking about her mother, to actually be condemned to be executed. She was reprieved, but died in a camp in Germany. So Flemming Muus was taken back by the SOE in September, so the SOE could find out what was going on in the Freedom Council, and above all that, prepare for, they felt, the coming of the end of the German presence in Denmark. So he was sent back for instructions. He was first time trying to get back, which was the end of November. The plane had to come back because of bad weather. Because he'd been in Africa, he went down with malaria, a bout of it, which kept him in England for 2 weeks. He was set to go out on the beginning of December, not with the crew, my father's. And then he was called in by the heads of the SOE to say all operations stopped because the Germans had infiltrated the resistance in Holland, all the Low Countries, because of this absolute situation, which for a year the Germans had infiltrated every SOE action in Holland, Netherlands. So they stopped Denmark. And Hollingworth and Flemming Muus on the 2nd of December went to persuade, I'll just say, whilst he was in England, he was given the DSO, the Distinguished Service Officer's Medal, by the Vice Prime Minister Attlee and Lord Shelburne. So that gives you the importance of Flemming Muus at that time. And he was called back, or he was called into, on the beginning of December, to explain to 36 members of the government and that the Danish resistance was not the Dutch resistance. And he managed to persuade them with Hollingworth, and they were scheduled to go out on the 7th of December with my father's crew. Unfortunately, bad weather stopped them going out. We have particularly a 9-page written story from Fry, written 3 days after the crash, so we know well what happened. I won't detail that. But the idea was 2 drops, 9 containers of explosive and 1 agent. and the drop was to be taken not very far from Holbeck. I can't imagine trying to pronounce it. So the pinpoint was a heart-shaped lake. Those will be with us tomorrow will see it. And also, that's where one of the main resistance leaders, Stig Jensen, had his farm. And that was where they were scheduled to drop. Unfortunately, flying over that spot, they were attacked by a night fighter. This is the night fighter. Not only, but although we don't have the photo of the pilot, we have a photo of the record of the actual gunner who shot them down. They were shot at 3 times. They didn't have a chance to parachute out, they were too low. He was rather remarkable fighter pilot. He shot down 12 planes of the Air Force. And in 1945, in May, he actually took one of the planes because of the liberation and flew down to Portugal and never seen again. Anyway, the plane, really there wasn't much hope. The only hope they had was a frozen ground, and Barter decided to crash land the plane. They crash land the plane. These are some of the photos which the Germans took. And by a miracle, because they didn't have the gunner top, they managed to get out of the top of the plane. And you don't forget, it was on flames and there were 9 containers of explosives. And they managed to divide between the officers. My father was commissioned. In fact, he was already informed he was a flight lieutenant to become flight sergeant to become flight lieutenant 2 days before flying out. But he was not officially commissioned. So the 3 officers, my father was not then an officer, but the 3 officers, they split between officers and non-commissioned because they would be in different prisons of war of court. So the 3 who were the officers followed. They had instructions with it. They went all the way through, they got lost, and ended up knocking on the door of a farm. And the guy spoke absolutely no English or anything. And the father gave him somewhere to stay. And when they came back, this is Barter's, one of them, in uniform of Barter. Why? Because came back with them was a man who spoke Canadian, not English, Canadian, because he'd been in Canada for 10 years, saw Fry was part of the Canadian Royal Air Force, and basically it's thanks to this family, Krugermeyer and Fryston, that they were able to escape. We talk about courage. It's really the courage of a family. Took the risk. And Krugermeyer, his son, will be there later on today. They managed to get Barter and the other 2 back to Sweden, over to Sweden, back to England. Because of that, they were victimized or threatened that the Germans would have retaliation, and they had to leave and change their names. So there's a lot of very, very brave people whose stories decide to be told. My father, he wasn't sure why they were given away, I'll explain, but this we found, and I must say this is all due to the support I have from Jan Christensen. This was published on the 13th of December, and this essentially says what? Anybody helping this aircrew, because the Germans knew Flemming Muus was on the plane by this time, would automatically be executed. My father's 5 non-commissioned officers, well, that's them, the others getting back to Sweden. My father's group, they knocked at farmhouses. They got up to here, they thought there and get to Sweden. And unfortunately, on the 3 days after landing, they stayed in one farmhouse, and the farmhouse, an elderly farmer, gave them shelter. with Jan, we've identified where the farm was, or is, and the actual where they stayed. But on the 13th, when they woke up, there were 50 German soldiers around the farmhouse. The farmer had given them away. So, in their case, their war was over. And they were taken by there to Frankfurt, where the all aircrew were questioned and then sent to a prisoner of war camp near Dresden called Stalag 4. This is Stalag 4. The Air Force, 30,000 people, or different nationalities. The British were at the top in the camp. My father stayed, and the 5 others as well, they all stayed together, were there for until April 1945. That's my father's prisoner of war tags, which I still have, Stalag 4, that was his number. Never ever talked about it. I don't think it was certainly not a concentration camp by any means, but it must have been hard to be a prisoner of war. And what remains in Dresden now is more of a park. You can see parts of it's still remaining just outside Dresden. I'll come back. We're talking about this. I showed you the photo of the crew. This was in fact, this young man, because he remains young, was in fact from Argentina. His father was British. We actually know which boat he came across. Anyway, he was one of the 3 officers who got back to England. Jan Christensen, when we did research in the National Archives, came across his passport, which is in the British Archives, because he, unfortunately, on the 138, a year later, his plane disappeared over the North Sea and was never seen again. So he escaped, got back, and then a year later had the tragedy. I could always ask myself, and my father being commissioned, was an officer, got back, would he have survived? Would I be here today? So this is a later stage, many years later. It's a letter from Flemming Muus to my father, Flemming Muus's wife, my stepmother, and Flemming Muus's wife. They were fairly close towards the end. Flemming Muus died in the 80s. My father came for the liberation celebration 50 years ago. This apparently is a famous person in Denmark, and this was on the spot of where the plane crashed. It's my father's. This is my father with 3 very distinguished people of the SOE, Group Captain Verity and Sir Louis Hodges, who became Air Chief Marshal, head of the British Air Force. These were pilots in the 161. They were flying in, flying out. These are 2 legendary people. Sir Brooks Richards ended up as an intelligence officer, but as I said to Mark, he has a history of James Bond, because every time you find him later on as ambassador in Vietnam during the Vietnamese War, in Ireland, he was always there somewhere where there were hostile action. My father probably had the most difficult post-war and really requires courage to say. He became a bank manager, and to be a bank manager today takes more courage than being a pilot in the Royal Air Force. This is the Thamesford reunion, which we have every November on this legendary airfield. All that's remaining is what's known as Gibraltar Farm. That's where the agents were kept. But never did the aircrew know who they were flying out. They knew where they were going 24 hours before, but they didn't know with whom. And this was me coming back 70 years when I came back to Roskilde. I hadn't planned anything, and I came back, and it was quite remarkable by the people that were waiting, including friends of my father, Soren Lund. Soren, having been the military attaché in London, my father knew, and Grun was, I didn't know, but worked in the museum. It's basically that relationship, and having met Jan Christensen allowed me to, in the past year, develop a certain research and worked up to the event which we have today. And I'd like to as well thank the different people from the volunteers who helped do research or mining metal detection this year, and over 1,000 parts of the plane were found, including a grenade. So I'd like to thank everybody who's participated over the past year. It's been quite an experience trying to put it all together. As well, particularly I'd like to thank Jan Christensen, who's actually written a book on the whole story, and it's called The Heart-Shaped Lake. And the RAF is in fact the thumbprint of the unfortunate officer who died in 1944. So that, a bit too long maybe, is the story, which is not my father's story. It's the story of many aircrew of the 138. Thank you for your attention.